It's the middle of winter in the hill country outside Bethlehem. The nights are cold enough that shepherds, by long-standing custom, bring their flocks in off the open hillsides and under shelter for the season. And yet Luke's gospel describes something else entirely. Luke 2:8. There were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. Out in the field at night, in the one season, shepherds usually weren't there at all. That single detail has quietly bothered careful readers for centuries. And once you start pulling on it, it doesn't let go. Welcome back. Today isn't a video where I just tell you Christmas is pagan and walk away. We're going to do something slower first. Follow the actual clues sitting inside Scripture, do the math ourselves, and find out when Yeshua was most likely born. Then once we know what we're actually working with, we're going to look at where December 25th and everything wrapped around it actually came from. By the end, you'll have walked the evidence yourself. One quick note if you're new here, I use the name Yeshua throughout this channel instead of Jesus. Same person, same claim, it's simply the original Hebrew name. Behind the name, most Bibles translate into English. Yeshua, meaning Yahweh saves. We did an entire video tracing exactly how that name passed through Hebrew, Greek, and Latin on its way to becoming Jesus. So if you want the full unpacking, it's linked below. For today, just know, same person, same name, we're using the one he actually answered to. So, when was he actually born? Start with that shepherd detail because it's the loosest thread, and pulling it unravels a lot. Shepherding in Judea followed a known seasonal pattern. Flocks stayed out on open pasture through the warmer months and were brought in under shelter once the cold, rainy season set in, roughly November through March. Luke doesn't describe shepherds huddled indoors waiting out the winter. He describes them out in open fields at night, watching their flocks the way they would in spring, summer, or early fall, not the dead of winter. Here's a second thread, easy to miss. Luke 2:1-3 tells us Caesar Augustus had ordered a census, and everyone traveled to their own city to register. Empires didn't schedule mass movements of people across bad roads in the coldest, wettest stretch of the year if they could help it. A census tied to registration and taxation lines up far more naturally with a season after harvest, when produce could actually be assessed and roads were still passable, than with the dead of winter. Now the third one, and this one you can actually calculate, Luke 1:5, there was in the days of Herod the king of Judea a certain priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. 1 Chronicles 24 lays out the system behind that phrase. 24 priestly divisions, each one serving a set week of temple duty on a fixed rotating calendar. Abijah was the 8th division in that rotation, which means Zechariah's service week sits at a calculable point in the yearly cycle. Luke 1:23 and 24, as soon as the days of his service were completed, he departed to his own house. Now, after those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived. 6 months into that pregnancy, Luke 1:26, Gabriel comes to Mary. 9 months after that, Yeshua is born. Zechariah's service week, plus Elizabeth's pregnancy, plus the 6-month gap to Mary, plus Mary's own 9 months. Run that chain forward, and it lands you again and again in the same general stretch. Not December, the 7th Hebrew month, Tishri, which happens to be exactly the month we spent an entire series on. Tishri is the month of trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles, the last 3 feasts on Yahweh's calendar, the ones we walked through episode by episode not long ago, and if that's where the evidence actually points, one detail from that series reads completely differently now. John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We already talked about the word behind dwelt in the Tabernacles episode. It's skanu in Greek, tabernacled, the exact same root behind the Feast of Tabernacles itself, the feast about Yahweh's presence, pitching a tent among his people. If Yeshua was born in Tishri, near that same feast, that phrase stops being a poetic flourish. It becomes a description. The Word didn't just tabernacle among us in some abstract sense. He very likely showed up in a body during the actual week. Israel was already building temporary shelters and remembering that Yahweh dwells with his people, the shepherds, the census, the priestly calendar, 3 separate threads all pointing the same direction, and none of them pointing to December. So, where did December 25th and everything else we think of as Christmas actually come from? Not from Scripture. Not one verse names a month, a season, a date. Here's what December 25th was actually doing on the calendar before anyone attached his name to it. Rome already had a festival running right through that stretch of the year. Saturnalia, honoring the god Saturn, ran from December 17th through the 23rd or 24th, a week of feasting, gift-giving, and role reversal that was, by every ancient account, the loudest party on the Roman calendar. And in 274 AD, the Emperor Aurelian took the day immediately following it, December 25th, and declared it Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, marking the point in the solstice cycle when daylight finally starts winning back ground from the dark. The earliest record we have of December 25th being kept as an annual celebration of Yeshua's birth is a Roman document called the Chronograph of 354, over 300 years after the fact, landing on a date the empire had already spent generations celebrating as something else entirely. And once you start looking at what actually fills that season, tradition by tradition, the pattern doesn't stop at the date. The evergreen tree, long before anyone strung an ornament on it. In his name, Germanic tribes decorated trees with fruit and candles in honor of Odin. Romans hung small metal tokens on trees during Saturnalia itself, and multiple ancient cultures treated evergreens as symbols of life continuing through the dead of winter. None of that started as a celebration of a Judean birth. Mistletoe, Druids, and Norse peoples both held it sacred, believed it carried healing power, and used it to broker truces between enemies. The tradition of a kiss underneath it traces back to old British custom, not to Bethlehem, wreaths and holly. Romans exchanged holly wreaths during Saturnalia for luck and protection, and holly's evergreen branches were carried indoors in the dead of winter to guarantee, symbolically, that green things would return. The crown of thorns, meaning, got layered onto it centuries later, after the plant was already part of the season. The Yule log, a Norse tradition, burned through the 12 days of their own midwinter festival, Yule, to keep the feast going, and the light burning against the year's longest nights. Gift-giving itself. Romans exchanged small presents during Saturnalia, hoping for good fortune in the year ahead, long before it became anything else. Not one of those traditions started in a manger. Every one of them was already sitting on the calendar, attached to festivals that had nothing to do with Scripture before his name ever got attached to any of it. Here's what I want you to walk away with. Yahweh already had a calendar, 7 appointed times, set at creation, kept for thousands of years, each one pointing to something true about who he is and what he was going to do. We've walked through every one of them on this channel. Yeshua's birth doesn't need a borrowed date or borrowed rituals invented centuries later and layered on top of it. The evidence in the text points to a real season, a real feast Yahweh had already set apart, the one that was always about him moving in and staying. Tell me honestly, which thread pulled at you the most? The shepherds still out in the cold fields, the math on Zechariah's priestly week, or finding out how many of your own Christmas traditions never had anything to do with him to begin with? I'd genuinely like to know where you land.